So far, you know that residential construction was ground zero for the recent recession. And you also know that residential construction is intimately tied up with interest rates, and that the Federal Reserve policy of depressing interest rates during the dot-com bust led to the recent boom and then, of course, the subsequent collapse. So a natural thought on your mind is, well, how did the Federal Reserve lead into this policy, and what motivated the Federal Reserve to follow this policy, even though, of course, it led to the subsequent crisis? Let's return to chart 6.1, the federal funds rate, which is just a record of the rate that the banks paid any time they borrowed reserves from the Federal Reserve. Let's also take a look at the same time at chart 5.1, which is the change in consumer prices, often referred to as the CPI, Consumer Price Index. And it will strike you, of course, how close a match there is between chart 5.1, the change in consumer prices, and chart 6.1, the federal funds rate, which is just our measure of short-term interest rates. Notice especially the peak around 1980, both in the interest rates and the consumer prices. So why did the prices and interest rates rise until 1980, and why did they fall subsequently? And what does that have to do with Federal Reserve policy? It's simple enough. Before 1980, the Federal Reserve's bias was expansionary. What the Federal Reserve wanted to do was reduce interest rates in order to stimulate the economy. Low interest rates, more borrowing, more spending, faster economic growth. And the Federal Reserve, by and large, did this. The problem was that periodically, economic activity became so robust and demand grew so rapidly and was so strong that that surge in demand pulled prices upward. Let's take a look for an example. If you take this chart of the change in consumer prices, you can see, for instance, let's take some outstanding examples. You can see that the rate of inflation, that's the change in consumer prices, rose to about 6% around 1970. And then it surged to about 12% in 1973. And then it surged again to about 15 or 16% in 1979. Well, all those are emblematic of a rapid increase in demand. Now let's get back to the interest rates. And sure enough, if you look at the interest rates, you see the same thing. A big surge and peak of interest rates in the late 60s, another big surge in the early 70s, and another one in the late 70s. What's going on here? Well, let's look at it this way, and I think this will explain it. What the Federal Reserve did was it reduced interest rates, expenditure boomed, and that, of course, led to inflation. And because of inflation, the Federal Reserve then, as you can see in chart 6.1, would have to raise rates. Well, raising rates choked off expenditures and led to recession. Then the Fed would reduce interest rates to try to pump the economy back up again. Well, clearly what happened is that in these cycles, the upward surge in prices was greater than the downward drop of prices during recession. So in boom, the prices rose more than they fell during recession. What was the effect on interest rates? The effect on interest rates, of course, was parallel. No lender is going to lend at a rate of interest which is less than the rate of inflation. If prices surge, interest rates will too. So sure enough, as prices surged, so did interest rates. And going back to chart 6.1, you can see they reached a peak in 1980. And so we're in a jam now. The Federal Reserve has tried to generate a climate of economic expansion, but instead has generated a climate of surging inflation and consequently rapidly rising interest rates.